Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Mans, and I would like to share with you my presentation, The Recipe for Student Achievement, the key ingredients to establishing an effective learning environment, which summarizes the fundamental ideas presented in chapters 10 through 17 of The First Days of School by Harry K. Wong and Rosemary T. Wong. It is my hope that you will be able to extract an idea or two from it to enrich the instruction and learning that take place in your classroom. Both prospective and veteran teachers learn in Chapter 10, Why You Want a Well-Managed Classroom, that the one ingredient that establishes a productive learning environment and that contributes to effective instruction and enhanced student learning is classroom management. Unlike behavior management, which focuses on disciplining students, classroom management refers to the procedures and routines a teacher develops to organize and structure an array of classroom and instructional activities, and ultimately to maximize student learning. As the chapter asserts, when students know what to do without prompting or supervision, they become responsible for their own learning and begin to practice self-discipline. As a result, they are engaged in instruction and do what they need to do to succeed. As will be conveyed in Chapter 17, without classroom management, teachers can expect to experience a disorderly classroom where little to no learning happens and various discipline issues abound. To illustrate, when I first started working in education, I had no formal training in the field. After all, as a substitute teacher, I was only responsible for implementing plans left by the classroom teacher. Therefore, when I was promoted to an English learner's instructor, I had no concept of all that is involved in managing a classroom properly. I just knew that I needed to develop rules that would preserve an orderly learning environment. If students failed to comply with said rules, they would receive appropriate consequences. However, during the first few years of teaching, I quickly learned that this approach to managing a classroom is not effective. It seemed that I was constantly dealing with one discipline problem after another. Really, it was not until I began attending a host of professional development sessions on classroom management and taking this course that I gained a better understanding of the elements that constitute a well-managed classroom. Once I began teaching, rehearsing, and reinforcing my classroom procedures and expectations with my students, I realized a huge difference in the number of behavior issues I had to confront. To date, I feel that my classroom operates more efficiently and productively because my students know exactly what they need to do from the moment they enter my classroom until they leave. Finally, the instructional activities I plan for my students are intentional in that they provide them with meaningful practice of their targeted learning goals. Moreover, students find them engaging. When discipline issues do arise, I use the established procedures and expectations as a reference to address those issues. That way, instruction can resume in a timely manner, and students do not feel that they are being singled out or punished. Arguably, one of the most important chapters in the text, The First Days of School, Chapter 11 draws attention to the significance of teacher preparedness in terms of having a classroom management plan in place and organizing a physical classroom space for instruction and learning. Initially, the chapter reiterates what is underscored in Chapter 10. Implementing a classroom management plan on the first day of school ensures that students will adopt as a daily routine the procedures established by the teacher. In effect, students will assume control of their learning and be less likely to engage in behavior that is not conducive to learning. Equally important to developing and carrying out a classroom management plan is preparing the physical classroom space for instruction and learning. As the chapter discusses, everything from how a teacher decorates his or her classroom to the orientation of students' desks requires deliberate consideration and planning. Each school year, I strive to create a learning environment that is welcoming, attractive, and meaningful to my students. For example, as an English learner's teacher of students whose family language is Spanish, I express my respect and recognition of their home countries and cultures by suspending in my classroom the flags of all the countries in Latin America. In addition, I feature a community quilt on one of my bulletin boards that exhibits the headshot of my students and a brief description of their cultural backgrounds and personal interests. In addition, as Chapter 11 advises, I reserve one bulletin board for important news and emergency information, and yet another for the display of student work. By doing the latter, I cultivate self-pride, self-confidence, and self-motivation in my students. Seeing the finished product of their efforts exhibited in such a manner encourages them to always try to do their best. As the old adage goes, first impressions are everything. This is particularly true of teachers and students who meet each other for the first time. The way a teacher presents himself or herself to his or her students will set the tone of the classroom for the rest of the school year. In brief, Chapter 12 outlines various ways teachers can create a welcoming, safe, and work-oriented learning environment before and on the first day of school. For example, teachers can send a letter or postcard to their prospective students to welcome them to class and to express how excited they are to serve as their teacher in the forthcoming year. In addition, teachers can greet and exchange pleasantries with students at the entrance of the classroom every day. Understanding the importance of the latter, I endeavor every day to meet and greet my students with a warm smile and a fist bump as they enter my classroom. Sadly, for some of my students who derive from unstable households, I may be the only person who shows them care, love, and acceptance. Also, I find that students are more likely to demonstrate a positive attitude, agreeable behavior, and hard work when I welcome them to the classroom. Generally, days prior to the start of classes, I mail a letter to my students to communicate how much I am looking forward to having them in my class and helping them advance their English language skills. Additionally, I include a request to parents and guardians to provide me with the best way to contact them so that I can establish and maintain an open line of communication with them. That way, I can keep them up to date on their child's progress, and they can reach out to me whenever the need arises. Given that many of the parents of my EL students are strictly Spanish speakers and I am bilingual, I am their only means of staying abreast with what is happening at school. Incidentally, when I taught a cultures and languages class last semester, I created passports for my students to fill out as they researched information about a particular country. In order to enter the classroom, they were required to present their passports to be stamped. This activity not only gave them a sense of what would be required of them in a real life situation, but it was a fun way for them to be welcomed into the classroom each day. Moreover, it instilled in them responsibility. If they arrived to the classroom without their passports, they would not receive a stamp. The number of stamps students had by the end of a given week would determine if they could participate in a classroom-based incentive. One of the most important decisions that a teacher has to make from time to time, especially at the beginning of the school year, is how to orientate student seating and determine seating assignments. Chapter 13 specifies when to create certain seating arrangements and for what purposes seating assignments should be made. In general, seating arrangements are not fixed. They will and should change during the course of the year based on the tasks that teachers will have their students to do and how teachers and students will communicate with each other. For example, I create a horseshoe arrangement when I engage students in a class discussion or the recitation of a drama. This design allows the students to see the teacher in front of the classroom, as well as each other. Also, I place 2 to 4 desks together when I plan for students to work with a peer on certain assignments. Lastly, because I generally administer benchmark and standardized testing to my students, I generally isolate the desks around the classroom to optimize student concentration and reduce distractions. Chapter 13 also speaks about the thorough consideration that should go into making seating assignments. Typically, on the first day of classes, I allow my students to sit wherever they like. I generally work with small groups of students at a time, so I do not encounter the problems that much larger classes have with this privilege. By doing so, I give my students choice, and I implicitly communicate my trust in them. Once students decide where they will sit, I immediately inform them that the seat they chose will be their assigned seat until further notice. In fact, by the end of the school day, I will have posted an index card on each desk bearing the name of the student whose seat it is. Typically, I only alter student seating assignments when issues of disruption arise. By the middle of the first semester, there always seems to be at least 2 people who show that they cannot get along with each other for whatever reason. In order for instruction and learning to happen, it becomes necessary for me to relocate students from time to time. To create and maintain an effective, structured, and productive learning environment, there are 2 actions that teachers should execute the first day of classes and continue consistently throughout the school year. Start class on time and present a daily agenda of activities that is visible to students. Chapter 14 underscores the importance of these 2 measures. In fact, the authors point out that starting class promptly results in maximized instructional time, the immediate establishment of a learning environment, and the reduction in tardy and referral rates. In addition, by posting a daily agenda of instructional and learning activities in a consistent place in the classroom, teachers transfer the responsibility of learning to students and, in effect, enhance student achievement. Essentially, the agenda should include an opening assignment, such as a bell ringer, a schedule of the instructional and learning activities that will occur during class, and the targeted learning objectives. In order to establish and maintain an effectively productive classroom each school year, I have an agenda of activities posted in the same location on the classroom whiteboard, and I strive to commence instruction on time. Incidentally, the latter is usually a challenge because my first group of EL students arrives at different times from their homeroom classes. Nevertheless, as soon as they enter the classroom, they know to reference the agenda on the whiteboard where I cite the bell ringer, the sequence of academic activities that will take place during class, and the daily learning goal. Additionally, if there are any special directions related to the bell ringer that I need to convey to students, I project them onto the smartboard. Generally speaking, the bell ringers I issue to my students are associated with a learning target for either a previous day's or an impending instructional period. In the former case, students are able to receive extra practice and are able to demonstrate their proximity to achieving the intended learning objective. With regard to the latter, students can reveal any background knowledge and skills they have concerning upcoming learning goals. Although I will occasionally distribute to students some type of handout for them to complete as a bell ringer, I typically have my students work on IXL exercises, which is an online application whose content is aligned with the Virginia SOLs. Review vocabulary and content concepts by assessing Quizlet or playing quizzes or Kahoot, or complete a performance-based activity such as composing a paragraph. As the foundational premise of the first days of school, every effective teacher and classroom are guided by a classroom management plan. Inherently, any classroom management plan consists of procedures. In short, Chapter 14 stresses the importance of and purposes for establishing classroom and instructional procedures and how to successfully impart them to students. Unlike rules, which are designed to govern behavior, procedures outline what students need to do to be successful in an academic setting. More specifically, they help make the learning environment a predictable, consistent, and work-oriented space for students, while allowing students to gain ownership of their learning. As a result, procedures reduce the incidence of discipline issues and maximize instructional and learning opportunities due to their capacity to create classrooms that reflect coherency, continuity, and consistency. By teaching, rehearsing, and reinforcing procedures with students on the first day of classes and throughout the school year, effective teachers promote student learning and achievement. Even though I have only completed nearly 4 years of professional teaching experience, I understand the marked difference between a classroom with procedures and one without. For example, I have worked with several novice and experienced educators who neglected to teach and or consistently implement classroom and instructional procedures. As a consequence, those teachers encountered constant discipline issues from many of their students. Moreover, I would literally hear many of the students inquire of the teachers almost on a daily basis what they would be doing in class. Conversely, in classrooms where there were obvious procedures in place, the students always seemed to be very engaged in instruction, and the transitions between activities occurred quite seamlessly. Interestingly, those teachers reported fewer behavior problems than teachers who always seemed to be at odds with their students. Inspired by the effect that procedures had on the classrooms of the more effective teachers at my school, I endeavor each school year to establish classroom and instructional procedures that I expect my students to follow closely. To that end, I explain and model those procedures and quickly remind students what they should do when they neglect to adhere to them. Typically, I reteach and rehearse my classroom procedures with students after returning to school from extended breaks, such as the winter and spring breaks. However, whenever the need arises, I take the time to revisit them with students. In doing so, students are reminded of what is expected of them. One thing I learned in Chapter 15 that I generally do not do but should is post my classroom procedures for students to reference. That way, I will not always have to personally remind them of the expectations. Rather, they can take on the responsibility for themselves. Another procedure I want to adopt is having students use a variety of hand signals to communicate what they need. As Chapter 15 mentions, a teacher who responds aloud to a student seeking help for something can disrupt the work of other students. Therefore, by teaching my students hand signals to communicate their needs, I can be more respectful of their learning. In Chapter 15, one learns that procedures are a series of steps used to perform an activity correctly. Furthermore, procedures that become routines for students allow them to gain ownership of their learning. Additionally, procedures constitute the foundation for a learning environment that is well organized, structured, and work-oriented. Chapter 16 explains how successful teachers are able to establish and maintain effective classrooms. They are proactive educators who understand the importance of developing classroom and instructional plans before the school year begins, and teaching, rehearsing, and reinforcing those plans from the very first day of classes to the end of the year. Moreover, the chapter outlines specific ways to implement different types of procedures, such as those related to forming student support groups and teaching note-taking. Chapter 16 reiterates the idea that procedures lead to coherency, consistency, and continuity in the classroom. Therefore, with procedures, there is a significantly reduced rate of discipline issues because students know what to do, when to do it, and how. For example, one of the procedures I have taught my students within the last 3 years is Cornell note-taking. This method of recording information derived from instruction is promoted through a nationally recognized academic program that my school district subscribes to, AVID, which stands for Advancement Through Individual Determination. Basically, students create two columns. In the right column, students record content notes. Conversely, in the left column, students create questions that align with the notes. Lastly, students respond to an essential question that was created by the teacher and that relates to the given notes by completing a summary at the bottom of the page. During the following few days, students are expected to interact with their notes by highlighting, underlining, or circling key terms and ideas. In addition, they can add any questions that they may have about the content. They will keep and study these notes for upcoming quizzes, tests, and class discussions. Incidentally, students are initially given a template for this type of note-taking. After sufficient practice, they create their own template on a sheet of paper. Ultimately, they become responsible for using the method to organize the notes they take in my class, as well as those taken in other classes. Another procedure I teach, rehearse, and reinforce with my students each year is how they are expected to participate in collaborative learning groups. For example, I stress to students that everyone in a group will be responsible for contributing to the work to be completed by the group. Moreover, everyone should respect one another and defer to each other for help before calling on me for assistance. Additionally, I remind student groups to make use of the question and sentence frames I place in each group to help facilitate conversations. Regardless of the group activity I have students to do, they know to observe these procedures. When they fail to execute them, I reinforce the procedures by rehearsing them with the students until they get them right. In Chapter 17, How to Have an Effective Discipline Plan, the authors point out how classroom management and behavior management are unique endeavors, yet the two are closely connected. As we have understood previously, classroom management is concerned with the use of procedures to create and maintain an organized and productive learning environment, whereas behavior management focuses on managing student behaviors so that students will practice self-discipline and act in a proper, civil, and responsible manner. However, as the Wongs emphasize, the most effective teacher is one who develops a classroom management system that includes a discipline plan. In doing so, the teacher is able to curtail the number of discipline issues that will unavoidably occur in his or her classroom. After all, when students know what to do and how to do it, they are less likely to engage in inappropriate behavior. Therefore, the teacher can direct his or her attention to teaching and student learning rather than expending precious instructional time on implementing an array of intervention measures. Chapter 17 also distinguishes between two approaches to behavior management. The first one deals with the enforcement of rules and consequences, while the second one concentrates on a discipline plan that is cooperatively developed by teachers and students. As the chapter acknowledges, there is no one-size-fits-all discipline plan. The particular students a teacher works with and the circumstances of the learning environment may require the teacher to use more than just one approach. Personally, during the few years I have been teaching professionally, I have practiced both of the aforementioned plans while working with several groups of students. More specifically, I have personally found that the cooperative approach is more effective with larger groups of students, and the plan based on rules and consequences more appropriate for smaller class sizes. For example, with my small cohorts of English learners, I formulate rules and expectations before the commencement of classes. I set aside time throughout the school year to make sure that the students are well aware of those rules and expectations and the positive and negative consequences associated with them. With larger class sizes, the students and I develop classroom rules together on chart paper and come to a consensus on the ones that will best contribute to a safe and productive learning environment. Once the rules are approved by everyone, I have each student sign the chart paper as if it were a contract. I inform them that, like any other contract you sign, you agree to accept and abide by the rules and their consequences. In addition, I send a copy of the rules home with the students to be reviewed by a parent. In turn, the parent is required to sign it and send it back to me. Lastly, I file it in the student's classroom folder. By doing this, there is never a question from students why they are receiving a particular consequence for a given behavior. Also, because the contract is constantly on display in the classroom, it reminds them daily of the expectations they agree to follow. With regard to the negative consequences or penalties and positive consequences or rewards that students receive for inappropriate or exemplary behavior, respectively, I followed the directives of a school-wide behavior management program called PBIS, or Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. Basically, when students demonstrate appropriate behavior, they receive weekly incentives that include, but not limited to, the use of technology, such as cell phones, iPads, etc., during lunch in the cafeteria, homework passes, and a shout out through the PA system during the morning announcements. Moreover, they are eligible to attend assemblies and other special events that occur at the end of almost every grading period. On the contrary, those students who defy expectations receive a behavior infraction. The first infraction that a student receives requires him or her to complete a think sheet, which is similar to the My Action Plan described in Chapter 17. Essentially, the student identifies the problem behavior, recognizes the impact the behavior has on others, and develops a plan to correct and avoid it. Furthermore, the student must take it home for a parent to review, sign, and send back to the school. If the student continues to practice similar or other forms of misconduct, a phone conference is set up with a parent or guardian to obtain support from home. Depending on the severity of the behavior, the student could face in-school suspension or be required to temporarily attend the alternative education program that is operated by the school district. To ensure that students are aware of and know how appropriate behavior in school looks like, my school developed a behavior matrix that is aligned with the PBIS program, and that is based on the following core behaviors: be safe, be responsible, be respectful, and be successful. The matrix explains how these behaviors look in various settings at school, such as the bathrooms, hallways, cafeteria, and the classroom. Like the other teachers at my school, I teach, model, rehearse, and reinforce these behaviors with my students throughout the school year. As a result, I experience fewer discipline issues from my students. Moreover, they unquestionably understand when they receive a negative or positive consequence for certain behaviors. Going forward, though, in order to optimize instruction and learning in my classroom, I intend to use more specific praise when a student correctly follows procedures and expectations, and emphasize to students that every action has a consequence. Those consequences can be negative in the form of a penalty, or they can be positive in the form of a reward, namely academic success. Ultimately, I want my students to develop intrinsic motivation to do well academically and behaviorally by practicing self-discipline and accepting greater ownership of their learning. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope that you were able to obtain some practice or procedure from the presentation that you can use to optimize your instruction and your students' learning.